Dot.
I'm 41, and I never intended to spend my life in the neon glow of a data center. I just kept saying yes to the graveyard shifts, and eventually, that hustle turned into a career. 15 years ago,
You.
I was a night shift technician in Phoenix, constantly staring at blinking dashboards and praying nothing turned red. One night, the cooling system in the primary cage failed. My on-call manager was nowhere to be found,
Fix.
so I spent the night elbow deep in coolant and sweat, stabilizing the racks before the sun came up. The client never even knew they had been a heartbeat away from a total blackout. The next morning, my manager pulled me aside and said something that defined my entire career.
Dot.
Uptime isn't about being a hero, it's about making sure nobody ever needs one. That became my gospel: stability, redundancy, change control, the invisible work that keeps the world turning, while everyone else pretends the internet is powered by magic. I'm a divorced dad now, raising my 12-year-old son, Jensen, mostly on my own.
Fair.
His mother moved to Seattle 3 years ago for a temporary job, but temporary became permanent. So, it's just me and Jensen in a small apartment in Charlotte, North Carolina. For the last 6 years,
5 served.
as the operations
Lead at Sentinel Ridge Hosting.
we manage the infrastructure for banks, healthcare providers,
Feeble.
and massive e-commerce platforms places where 5 minutes of downtime leads to seven-figure losses and screaming lawyers. Every Sunday night, Jensen and I have a ritual: Chinese takeout and old sci-fi movies.
It's our sanctuary.
Those Sunday nights are the only hours in my week where my phone stays in the other room, completely ignored. That context is important because when my boss told me my family eats because of her,
She wasn't just insulting my work.
she was telling me she owned those Sunday nights too. The promotion meeting lasted exactly 10 minutes. I checked my watch when I walked into the office and again when I walked out,
Vince.
stunned that a decade of my blood and sweat could be dismissed in less time than it takes to reheat a meal. Sentinel Ridge had been dangling the infrastructure director title in front of me for 2 years. Every quarter,
Feeding you the same script.
"You're doing great work, Ronnie. Keep it up, and we'll get you there." It's the corporate version of telling a child, "We have food at home." But I kept it up anyway.
Things.
I maintained the entire Eastern region's uptime, above 99.99 for 18 months straight. I built the incident response playbook that every other region adopted as their standard.
Phage.
I personally managed the account for Meridian Financial, our biggest client, guiding them through 2 massive migrations without a single error. The numbers were impossible to argue with.
Resolution time.
Was down by 30%. Client retention was at 97. I had 0 regulatory findings in 3 consecutive audits. I arrived at that meeting with my metrics printed out, tabbed,
Fein highlight.
as evidence for a trial. I naively believed I was going to win, but Gwen, my VP of operations, sat across from me with that specific patronizing smile. It was the look of someone who had bad news, but wanted you to thank her for delivering it gently. She had that terrifying, corporate hostage negotiator energy. She explained that the timing wasn't right.
He claimed.
The board wanted someone with more cross-functional visibility. Translation: they wanted someone who plays golf with the right people and knows how to order wine at a steakhouse.
Vision.
They wanted someone who looked like leadership, rather than someone who actually did the work. I pointed out that I presented postmortems to the executive team 4 times that year.
View.
I reminded her that the CTO of Meridian Financial had my personal number and called me directly whenever he had a concern. Gwen just nodded and said leadership presence wasn't about the work, it was about the optics. He actually used the word gravitas without a hint of irony. Optics were Gwen's entire identity. She spent her career showing up to client meetings in expensive blazers, while I was underneath the server racks,
Feeble.
yet she somehow always managed to take the credit. She was the master of schmoozing at networking events, while her team handled the emergency pages.
View.
I once watched her present my own technical analysis to the board without mentioning my name a single time. She stood in front of slides I had built, explaining a failure I had diagnosed,
Things.
all while she was at a leadership retreat in Asheville, She looked at me and suggested, I just keep doing what I was doing. Give it 6 months. Maybe 9, she said. The hamster wheel. Just got another turn.
Fanged.
Einer, I stood up to leave, knowing the conversation was dead. But as I reached for the door, she stopped me and told me to sit back down. The polished corporate mask slipped for a second, and what I saw underneath was chilling.
You.
She looked at me not as a colleague, but as inventory and asset that was becoming a nuisance. I know recruiters have been reaching out to you, she said, her voice dropping an octave. I know you think you have options.
He leaned in.
Her eyes cold. You're a single father who needs stability, stabilities, health insurance, and predictable hours. A middle schooler isn't exactly portable. The job market isn't kind to people who job hop at our age.
Views.
She said at our age like we were in the same boat, as if she hadn't just spent the last 3 years keeping me in the basement of the company. Then, she delivered the line that changed everything. Know your place, Ronnie.
Family eats because of me.
I walked out of that office in a daze. I went home to Jensen, and we watched our movie. But I couldn't focus on the screen. I looked at my son, thinking about the security she threatened.
Using.
I realized that if I stayed, I would be waiting for a promotion that would never come, serving a woman who viewed my existence as a line item on a budget. That night, after Jensen fell asleep, I didn't go to sleep.
Fixed.
I opened my laptop. I had spent 2 years documenting every discrepancy, every missed slaw that Gwen had fixed by lying to the clients, and every piece of evidence showing that Inather was the one keeping the company alive.
Also pulled up an offer letter id.
Received 2 weeks earlier from a competitor. It was a significant salary bump, a senior title, and most importantly, it was a firm that valued actual engineering. I signed the offer at 3.
Fume so am.
The next morning, I didn't just resign. I requested an emergency meeting with the board of directors, citing critical operational concerns regarding client stability.
Thing.
They were terrified of losing Meridian Financial, so they took the meeting immediately. I brought the evidence. Not just the technical metrics, but the proof of how Gwen had systematically misled the board regarding the team's successes and her own lack of contribution. I laid out the timeline of the migrations, the incident reports, and the emails where she took credit for my solutions.
Fixed.
When Gwen walked into the conference room, she looked smug. She probably thought I was there to beg for my job back or apologize for the previous day's outburst. Instead, the chairman of the board held up a folder. Gwen,
Fend.
Ronnie has provided a very detailed audit of the last 3 years, he said, and he's resigned. Her face went pale, but she tried to double down.
Oh.
Ronnie is just disgruntled because he didn't get the promotion he wasn't qualified for, she stammered. He's being sensitive. It's just business. Actually, the chairman replied, it's not business to misrepresent technical vulnerabilities to the board, Gwen. That's a liability. The security team escorted her out of the building 5 minutes later.
You.
I didn't watch her leave out of spite. I watched because I wanted to be certain. The optics were clear for everyone else in the office. I started my new job a month later. I have a bigger office, a better title, and,
most importantly, I have my Sundays back.
Jensen and I still eat our Chinese takeout. But now, when my phone rings, I don't feel that cold knot in my stomach.
You know.
I don't look at the clock and wonder if my family's dinner is being held hostage by someone else's ego. I know my place, and for the first time in years, am the one who decides how it's built. The air in the office was stale,
Fagn.
heavy with the artificial scent of industrial cleaner and the silent grinding anxiety that defined life at Sentinel Ridge. I stood before Gwen Holloway's glass-walled office, the door slightly ajar,
Finny.
reflecting the dim lights of the corridor. She hadn't just told me I wasn't ready for the promotion, she had practically weaponized my own life against me. Her voice had been smooth, cold, and utterly dismissive.
Fingers.
The kind of tone that implies you are lucky to even be breathing the same air as her. Your family eats because of me, she had said, that leaning back in her leather chair, her fingers laced together with surgical precision.
Protected your position here.
And because I've kept your name off the layoff lists during every restructuring. A little gratitude and patience would go a long way, don't you think? I didn't respond,
Use you.
because to fight back in that moment would have been to play into her game. I didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing my pulse quicken or my face flush with the rage that was boiling in my chest. I simply nodded once,
Feel.
turned on my heel, and walked back to my cubicle, feeling every fiber of my being vibrate with a new, dangerous clarity.
View Q.
Something inside me had finally snapped the tension wire that had been holding my professional life together for years, had simply reached its breaking point. She had said the quiet part out loud,
Firming.
exactly what she thought of me. She didn't see me as a partner, a colleague, or even a competent professional. She saw me as a resource she could control,
Fend.
a man she could threaten with the stability of his own son's world just to keep him in his lane. That night, after I tucked my son Jensen into bed, I opened my laptop and updated my resume for the first time in 3 years.
Feason.
Gwen Holloway hadn't always been the villain, or perhaps I had just been too busy putting out the fires she didn't even realize she was lighting to notice the glass ceiling she was building over my head.
You do.
She had arrived at Sentinel Ridge 4 years ago, brought in from a massive competitor with a resume dripping in corporate buzzwords. Transformational leader, strategic visionary,
Feason.
passionate about building high-performance teams. Those phrases mean absolutely nothing, yet they sound like gospel to people who confuse arrogant confidence with actual competence.
View.
Her profile picture was professionally lit, perfectly airbrushed, and projected an image of a woman who never broke a sweat. Mine?
Fumed.
It was a grainy crop from a day at the zoo where Jensen was making bunny ears behind my head while I smiled at a tired camera. Within 6 months of her arrival,
Fee.
she had reorganized the entire operation structure to place herself at the heart of every single client interaction. Within a year, she had implemented a visibility protocol, fancy way of saying that no work could reach the directors unless it had been filtered, edited, and sterilized by her. In practice, nothing that mattered could be seen by the leadership unless Gwen forwarded it.
View.
And whenever she forwarded my work, my name was scrubbed from the history, replaced by her own. Credit went in, but attribution simply disappeared into the ether. It was pure magic.
Fin.
On it. The Meridian financial account was the most egregious example of her manipulation. I had inherited that account back when their previous vendor had suffered a catastrophic system-wide failure.
It was the kind of disaster
that gets whispered about in hushed tones at industry conferences and used as a cautionary tale in How Not to Do It presentations. CTO had been burned so badly, she refused to trust anyone on the phone, let alone a vendor. I spent 18 months rebuilding that trust, one incident-free month at a time,
Vivid.
answering my phone at 3 in the morning when the systems blinked. By the second year, the CTO was calling me directly,
Feel it.
bypassing the support line because she knew I'd give her the truth instead of the corporate drivel. Gwen spewed. She trusted my judgment, telling me explicitly that Sentinel Ridge kept their business because of me, not the brand.
Leadership. Just me.
Gwen's response. She forced her way into every correspondence, CC'd herself on every email,
Thing.
and scheduled executive calls that were nothing more than a stage for her to take credit for the stability I had cultivated. When the last contract renewal came up, she presented the entire relationship as her personal achievement, and I wasn't even invited to the meeting. Andre, our senior systems engineer, and the only person in the building who kept me sane.
Put it perfectly over coffee one afternoon.
Shez not managing operations, my friend, he muttered, staring at the monitors. Shez managing the narrative of operations. And in her story,
Fez.
always the hero saving us from the disasters she barely notices. Andre was a man who knew where the bodies were buried. He had seen 3 management regimes come and go.
Fact.
He could diagnose a network failure just by listening to the rhythmic clicking of the switches in the server room. He had started showing me the discrepancies,
Fengen.
pointing out how my 17-page root cause analyses would suddenly shrink to 3 pages after Gwen reviewed them. But funny how problems keep getting smaller the higher up they travel. he said one Tuesday.
Vexiness.
His voice heavy with cynicism. It's like reverse gravity. Except instead of things falling down, accountability just evaporates into thin air.
Free one of those.
Trimmed sections covered critical errors Gwen had made or authorized. The firmware update she forced through without testing because a client complained.
You the reduced.
Overnight staff she cut to boost quarterly numbers, the cooling maintenance she delayed. Every one of those decisions created a ticking time bomb. Every time I documented the risk,
Beacon.
my warnings disappeared into her editorial process, only to emerge, sanitized and blame-free. I wasn't just being denied a promotion, I was being used as a human shield for her incompetence. If everything went right,
Yushi.
she took the glory. If everything went wrong, I knew exactly whose name would be on the incident report, while she stayed in the clear. The Meridian contract renewal was looming again, along with a massive
Fakes platform migration.
Gwen was already positioning herself to lead it, which meant she would be in the meeting soaking up the light, while I did the grueling work in the shadows. Not this time.
You.
I had been interviewing for months, taking PTO for appointments that were actually video calls, conducted from my car in random parking lots around Charlotte.
Beast.
The offer from Redstone Infrastructure hit my inbox on a Tuesday afternoon. Director of Incident Operations, a 30% salary increase,
Thing.
total remote flexibility with only the occasional trip to their Denver headquarters, and most importantly, a contract clause I insisted upon, strict limits on on-call hours, and guaranteed comp time for any extra work.
Function.
I sat in my car, staring at the offer letter, the weight of years of resentment finally starting to lift. But I wasn't going to just quit and walk away quietly.
Thinget.
I had been building my own documentation for the past 6 months, a hidden archive of every unedited original report Gwen had tried to bury. I had a folder in a private,
Thingy.
encrypted cloud that contained the truth about the cooling failures, the missed security patches, and the direct emails where Gwen dismissed safety concerns to keep the budget looking pretty.
View.
The migration was scheduled for the coming Sunday, the busiest day of the year for the Meridian account. Gwen had insisted on being the only one with access to the core server controls during the rollout,
Fegs.
wanting to make sure she was the hero when it went off without a hitch. She didn't know that I had spent the last week setting up a mirror configuration,
Fendi.
a complete parallel environment that would reveal her lack of preparation. Sunday arrived with a strange, eerie calm. The Meridian CTO was on the conference call, expecting the smooth transition Gwen had promised.
Yoon.
Gwen was in her element, talking about strategic alignment and operational excellence while the screen sharing displayed the progress bars. I watched from my terminal, my heart beating in a steady, cold rhythm. At 2 p.m.,
Fend.
the moment the migration hit the critical node, Gwen's lack of testing hit back. The screens turned red. The alert started screaming in a symphony of failure. Gwen froze, face pale as she tried to force a reboot that the system couldn't handle. The Meridian Tactio's voice crackled over the line, sharp and demanding. Gwen, what is happening? Why is the primary server locked out?
Huge.
Gwen scrambled, her voice high and desperate. It's just a minor hiccup. We have everything under control. I didn't say a word. I just pulled up the internal chat, visible to everyone on the call, and pasted the original,
UT.
unedited documentation of the vulnerabilities I had warned her about 3 months prior. The CTO went silent. The silence on the line was deafening. Gwen, the CTO said, her voice dropping into a dangerous,
Facey register. Is this your report?
why does this warn about a failure that you told us was already fixed? Gwen's face fell as she realized the game was over. She looked at her screen, then at the chat window, then finally,
Vicky.
her eyes locked onto mine through the glass office wall. I didn't smile. I simply stood up, grabbed my jacket, and pulled the phone out of my pocket.
Bim.
I hit the leave meeting button and walked out of the office for the last time. I didn't look back at the chaos. I didn't look at the screen showing her panicked face. I walked to my car, started the engine,
Future.
and drove toward a future where my name would finally be attached to my own success. The final twist came 3 weeks later. While I was settling into my new role at Redstone, I received an email, not from Gwen.
From the board of directors at Sentinel Ridge.
They had found my archive, the one I had left behind in the company's server, perfectly labeled and timestamped.
Gwen hadn't just been fired.
She was being investigated for gross negligence and potential liability fraud. Justice isn't always a movie ending, but sometimes it's just a clean, quiet exit, leaving the architect of your misery trapped in the very structure they built to destroy you. I logged out of my old email for the last time, took a deep breath, and walked into my new office. For the first time in years,
View from my window
was clear. The neon lights of the Charlotte skyline blurred past my windshield. As I sat in the parking lot of a quiet shopping center, my laptop perched on the steering wheel. For 2 months,
been living a double life.
the interviews had been grueling, conducted in stolen moments between endless conference calls and the constant, suffocating demands of Sentinel Ridge hosting.
Frustrating. Redstone infrastructure was the light at the end of a long, dark tunnel.
Their CTO had been an engineer before he became a suit, a man who understood that system uptime isn't a miracle performed by tired employees.
The result of discipline and respect.
Before I signed the offer, I insisted on a 3-week buffer before my start date. I needed to breathe, to take my son, Jensen, camping,
Thinged.
and to wash off the grime of 4 years of thankless labor. They agreed without a hint of hesitation. On a rainy Wednesday, after Jensen had finally fallen asleep, I signed the contract. By Monday morning,
Fusion.
the background check was cleared and the confirmation was in my inbox. I was finally free. That afternoon, I walked into Gwen's office with a single sheet of paper. She looked up, her expression a mix of surprise and mild annoyance, likely bracing for another complaint about the failing Meridian migration project. I placed my resignation letter on her mahogany desk. This is my tweak notice. Gwen.
Fed.
My voice steady for the first time in years. My last day is the 28th. Silence filled the room, thick and heavy. I watched her face cycle through confusion, a brief, sharp flash of panic, and then the inevitable,
Practiced mask of the corporate manipulator.
Ronnie, let's be reasonable, she began, her tone dripping with fake concern. I know the promotion news was disappointing, but this is a temporary setback. You're an emotional thinker, not a strategic one. If you leave now, you're throwing away years of building relationships. I looked her straight in the eye. I'm not running away. Gwen, I'm moving forward. She leaned in.
Her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper.
Think about your son, Ronnie. Stability is a luxury, not a guarantee. The market is brutal right now, especially for people at our level.
Pathetic attempt to trap me in the same cage shed kept me in for years.
My decision is final, I replied, the words feeling like a physical weight lifting off my chest.
Fingsing.
Her demeanor shifted from the supportive mentor to the aggressive director. The Meridian migration is in 6 weeks, she snapped. You're the only one who knows the architecture.
Ilkas.
You're putting the entire client relationship at risk, the company at risk. I kept my voice calm, clinical. The migration plan is documented. The runbooks are exhaustive. Any competent engineer can execute them.
Fame the demand.
I had been expecting. I need you to delay your start date by 6 weeks. We need you to train your replacement. And I expect you to be on call as a paid consultant after you leave.
No. The word hung in the air, sharp and absolute.
I don't think she had heard me say no in 6 years. I am fulfilling my 2-week notice as per my contract, I said firmly. After the 28th, I am gone. No consulting.
Emergency calls, no exceptions.
She smiled, a thin, cold movement of her lips. I hope you know what you're doing, Ronnie. Decisions have consequences. The industry is a very small place. Yes, I replied.
Standing up.
It certainly is. For the next 2 weeks, the shift in the office was palpable. I stopped being the magic man who fixed every broken system before the clients even woke up. I stopped handling the weekend pages that were technically the responsibility of the junior team. I stopped bypassing the bureaucracy to make Gwen look good to the board. Day 1 of my notice,
Junior engineer pinged me about a backup cluster error.
hey, can you just bounce the service? The standard ticket process takes hours. Hot. Old Ronnie would have done it in seconds. New Ronnie replied. Follow the standard incident escalation procedure, as documented in Section 4.3 of the handbook. But that's so slow, he complained. The procedure exists to protect you, I wrote back.
Think.
I won't be here to fix your shortcuts anymore. Watching them struggle was like watching someone try to drive a car. They didn't know how to start. They were forced to read the very documents I had spent years writing,
Which they had ignored until now.
They realized quite suddenly that the processes weren't broke. They were just boring, slow, and necessary. When my final day arrived, I packed my bag, deleted my personal files,
Fingshi.
and walked out the door without looking back. I didn't sabotage a single thing. I simply stopped doing the work of 3 people for the salary of 1. As I drove toward the mountains to meet Jensen,
Venged.
my phone buzzed with an urgent email from Gwyn about a system instability at the Meridian project. I archived it without reading. The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I had ever heard.
Friend.
Justice isn't always a dramatic explosion. Sometimes, it's just the quiet satisfaction of watching the house of cards fall because the person holding it up decided to walk away. I was finally free.
For the first time in a decade.
I didn't care what happened to the servers. I only cared about what was waiting for me at the campsite. The road ahead was open,
Phew.
and the sunset over the horizon looked like a brand new beginning. The fluorescent lights of the Sentinel Ridge office hummed with a static tension that felt like a trap. I sat at my desk, quietly flipping through the heavy.
Labyrinthine pages of our internal runbooks.
It turned out that our established processes were perfectly functional, even if they were painfully slow. They were bureaucratic, yes,
They possessed
the exact level of rigor required for a high-stakes, regulated industry where every audit trail could be a lifeline. By the 3rd day of this new chaotic leadership era,
Freeze.
Gwen had scheduled an operations sync, which was just corporate speak for an emergency panic meeting where she could find someone to blame. She projected terrifying red graphs onto the main screen,
You.
showing resolution times spiking by 40%. She threw around buzzwords like operational velocity that I'm fairly certain she invented during her morning coffee. It sounded dire,
Feel.
which was exactly the point she was trying to drive home. She demanded to know why things were grinding to a halt and where the supposed sense of urgency had vanished. The room fell into an agonizing silence.
The kind that makes your skin crawl.
Junior engineers glanced nervously at one another, looking like students praying the teacher wouldn't pick them to answer a question. Someone coughed,
Fegs.
the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sterile air. This was the exact moment where the old Ronnie would have stepped in, rushing to offer a solution to keep the peace.
Feet.
But the new Ronnie just sat there with his hands folded in his lap, perfectly still, waiting for the trap to spring. I finally spoke, using my most helpful,
You.
polite tone to explain that we were simply following the documented change control procedures. I reminded her that this was in direct accordance with her own memo from last October.
Which emphasized strict process adherence and audit compliance.
I mentioned the exact document she had forced everyone to sign, affirming we had read and understood the rules after external auditors flagged our change management as a critical risk. Gwen's jaw tightened, a hard line forming across her face. That memo had been purely performative.
You.
A hollow gesture she assumed nobody would actually have the backbone to enforce. She had treated it as a simple checkbox exercise, a bit of SIA documentation that wasn't supposed to actually change the way we worked.
He tried to pivot.
Suggesting the room for professional judgment and that experienced team members should know when to bypass the rules. I agreed with her completely, nodding enthusiastically.
Before pointing out
That with the Meridian financial migration looming, it was vital to ensure every change was documented perfectly. I looked her straight in the eye and said we wouldn't want another audit finding
especially not right.
before a massive engagement with such a high-profile client. It was checkmate, delivered entirely through her own policy. She couldn't argue without contradicting her own mandate in front of the entire team. The meeting ended in a haze of confusion, leaving everyone wondering what exactly the protocols were.
The boss had effectively dismantled her own authority.
But it was death by process, and it was beautiful. That afternoon, I walked out at 5 o'clock on the dot.
First time in years
I had and stayed late to patch up some trivial disaster. My son, Jensen, had a basketball game at 6:30, and for the first time,
Fins.
I was going to be there for every second instead of catching the fourth quarter from the parking lot while frantically replying to emails. He spotted me in the bleachers during warm-ups and literally stopped dribbling.
Fins.
The ball bounced away, neglected, as he stared at me, grinned, and promptly got yelled at by his coach for losing his tot. They won by 6 points, and he played like a star.
Hitting a three-pointer that sent the crowd into a frenzy.
Later, over burgers at his favorite diner, he asked why I hadn't looked at my phone even once since we sat down. I told him about the new job, the director role,
Better pay.
and the fact that it was mostly remote. We weren't moving. The school was the same, and our life would remain intact. Except, I told him I'd actually be home for dinner, for the games,
Hershey.
and for Sunday movies that weren't interrupted by emergency pages. He thought about it for a long time, then whispered that the old way hadn't been working for either of us.
Vent.
The storm hit at 2:40 in the morning on the 9th day of my notice period. I woke up to 43 notifications and a voicemail from Andre that consisted of only 2 words. It's bad. Phone still had the old alert routing from when I used to handle extra rotations, a detail I hadn't bothered to scrub until now. It was just one more loose end on a handover list that suddenly felt like a million miles away.
Eastjet.
The Meridian Financial Primary Database Cluster had completely collapsed. It wasn't a graceful failover or a controlled maintenance window. It was a hard, catastrophic crash during a batch process.
You.
This was the kind of failure that turns auditors into detectives and causes lawyers to start drafting litigation. Their ESLA guaranteed 99.99% uptime.
Financial penalties that grew larger by the hour.
Every minute of downtime cost them $15,000 in direct losses, not counting the regulatory fines that would inevitably follow. By sunrise, they had been down for 4 hours, resulting in $6 million in exposure, with the meter still running and no resolution in sight. I could feel the panic radiating from the escalation emails. The disaster unfold in slow motion on my screen. I wasn't on call. I wasn't even supposed to be involved in the company's Oz daily operations anymore. But Andre called me.
You.
Answered partly because old habits are hard to break, and partly because I wanted to know what happened to the systems I had spent 6 years protecting. He explained it with his usual dry, deadpan delivery.
Fijum.
The crash was caused by a storage firmware update, an unapproved change that wasn't on the official calendar. The request had been pushed by a junior engineer.
E.g.
But Gwen had pressured him to force it through on a Friday night because the client's CTO had mentioned performance during a review. Gwen wanted the win before Monday so she could boast about Sentinel Ridge's responsiveness.
Deal.
She had told him to skip the staging environment testing, claiming we didn't have time for the full process on something this routine. It was classic Gwen. Quick, shiny results that looked impressive in a meeting, but were ticking time bombs under the hood. Maximum visibility, minimum diligence. It was the firmware equivalent of saying, "I'm sure it'll be fine," followed by a shocked,
Yoon.
"How could anyone have predicted this?" The answer, of course, was that everyone who actually understood change management could have predicted it. That was exactly why those processes existed in the first place. I had blocked dozens of identical requests over the years by insisting on proper testing, and I knew how those conversations usually went. But tonight, the silence in my house was peaceful, and for the first time, the burden of the collapse wasn't mine to carry. I put the phone down, turned off the screen, and closed my eyes, knowing that justice was already writing its own ending. I knew it was coming. This was the protocols of change management existed in the first place. Over the years, I had successfully blocked dozens of similar disasters.
Ring set.
standing my ground while insisting on rigorous testing and mandatory change windows. The scripts were always identical. Gwen would wrap her demands in the glossy packaging of client centricity,
Thing.
acting as if rushing a broken product was a favor to the people paying our bills. I would explain, with the patience of a seasoned engineer, that shortcuts are nothing more than delayed explosions. She would let out a long
Oracle sigh.
complaining that the technical operations team was too rigid and lacked business vision. And every single time I held the line anyway, but today was different.
Fict.
Without me there to act as the circuit breaker, there was no one left willing to tell her no. Nobody wanted to be the killjoy who slowed down the momentum, the person labeled as not a team player. So,
Feed.
they gave in to her demands, and now $6 million of infrastructure was currently turning into a pile of digital ash. Andre was a sharp guy, and he had come prepared.
Fence.
The email thread between and the junior engineer was absolutely damning in its clarity. She was far too politically savvy to ever put illegal orders in writing directly.
Fishy.
But the young engineer's replies were brilliant. He had summarized her verbal instructions with the precision of a man who knew he would need a parachute later. Smart kid. Dot. Per hour call.
PM.
You are ordering me to push the firmware tonight and skip all staging validation. He had written, just confirming this in writing before I proceed. Her response, sent barely 3 minutes later, was short and cold.
Correct.
The client is breathing down my neck, and I need this resolved before Monday. Get it done. Then the paper trail. The change request logged the bypass as expedited per VP approval, complete with her initials.
Print.
These were digital breadcrumbs leading directly to her front door. I told Andre to secure every bite of it. Take screenshots, I whispered. Export everything to the compliance folder and flag it for legal hold.
Formal let a single record be altered.
The formal incident review was set for Thursday. It was the standard corporate ritual for any outage that shattered our service level agreements. Usually, these meetings were Gwen's personal theater. She would facilitate them, ensuring the final report mirrored whatever narrative served her career best.
Dot.
Accountability would vanish,
Fanked.
and the lessons learned would always shift toward minor process tweaks that some other department would be responsible for. But this time, there was a new variable in the room. Because this outage had triggered Meridian's mandatory breach notification protocols. Their compliance team was demanding an independent review. They had insisted on bringing their own technical lead. Marisol Vega.
Fangle.
I had worked with Marisol on 2 previous migrations. She was a woman who didn't play office, politish. She only played with facts. She had a reputation for being a shark when it came to root cause analysis. The kind of engineer who would dig through 17 layers of corporate lies until she found the ugly truth. She once told me, my job is to find out what broke and why, and corporate feelings are completely irrelevant to me. And unlike my coworkers, she had access to raw logs that Gwen couldn't touch. I spent the days before the review organizing my files, every email where Gwen bullied the staff into skipping tests.
Every report she had sanitized to hide risks from the board.
A clean, cold timeline backed by undeniable evidence.
Fanked.
I wasn't looking to sabotage anyone. I was simply prepared to tell the truth when the truth was demanded of me. The meeting took place in the main executive conference room, the one with the expensive leather chairs and the view of the parking garage. Gwen was there, as was Andre, Marisol from Meridian, and an HR representative I hadn't seen in my 6 years at the firm. Doesn't attend postmortems unless someone is about to be fired. Her presence confirmed everything I needed to know. This wasn't an investigation. It was a public execution. Gwen opened the floor,
Valti.
attempting to control the tempo from the very first breath. She looked pristine, hair perfect, blazer pressed, that practiced, confident smile plastered on her face.
Use up.
She thanked everyone for being present during such a challenging week. She acknowledged that we had fallen short of expectations and claimed she took full responsibility for ensuring we do better in the future. I watched her closely. Taking responsibility for future improvement is a classic magician's trick. It's a way to distract the audience while the real evidence stays hidden in the other hand. Dot, let's focus on root cause analysis
He suggested smoothly.
rather than assigning blame. Translation, let's make sure the blame lands on someone beneath her. She looked at me, gesturing with a polite wave.
Finkel.
Why don't you walk us through the technical timeline, since you're so close to the data? She was inviting me to hand her the rope she would use to hang herself. I pulled up my 8 slides. Timestamps, log excerpts,
Email chainsit was reality.
presented with receipts. The incident began at 2:40 a.m. when the database cluster experienced a catastrophic failure. I began, my voice steady.
You.
The root cause was a storage firmware update that introduced a critical compatibility issue. The documentation for this firmware explicitly mandated staging environment validation before deployment. However,
Date was pushed to production at 11:34 p.m. last Friday.
I clicked to the next slide, revealing the screenshot of the change request. It was submitted at 9:45 p.m. and approved at 9:50 p.m. 5 minutes, I said.
Fexi. The silence hang in the room.
Standard control requires a 72-hour review window and mandatory validation. Both were waived. I pointed to the footnote on the document. The waiver reads,
Expedited per VP approval.
Gwen shifted in her seat, her smile tightening just a fraction of an inch. But her voice remained neutral. It was a judgment call based on client urgency, she interjected.
Bing.
Meridian had flagged prompt concerns that required prompt attention. Sometimes, she added, looking around the room for support, you have to balance the rigidness of process with the necessity of responsiveness.
Phew. Room went deathly quiet.
As Marisol leaned forward, her eyes locked on Gwyn. VP Holloway, Marisol began, her voice cold and devoid of sympathy. There is a difference between responsiveness and negligence.
Phew.
The logs don't just show a skipped test, Marisol continued, tapping her tablet. They show that the staging environment was actually reporting an error with that firmware 3 hours before you forced this update.
Fees.
You weren't responding to a client emergency, Gwen. You were trying to hide a technical failure so you could look good in the Monday morning executive report. Gwen's face drained of color,
Fake.
the mask of corporate professionalism finally cracking wide open. That's a lie, Gwen stammered, looking toward the CTO. But the CTO wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the HR representative,
Thing.
who was already documenting every word. The air in the room felt heavy, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Gwen tried to regain her footing, stuttering about standard industry practices.
But she was spiraling now.
I saw the HR rep glance at her watch, then back at the notes on her desk. The final fatal blow came from Marisol, who pushed a folder across the table toward the CTO.
Communications between VP Holloway and the engineering team,
Marisol said calmly. They prove not only that she bypassed that protocol, but that she intentionally misled the board regarding the stability of this update.
Gwen stood up.
Her hand shaking as she reached for her briefcase. You don't understand, she started, her voice rising in desperation. This company relies on me. No, Gwen, I said, finally speaking up, as I looked her straight in the eyes. This company relies on the truth. And today, the truth finally caught up with you. She looked around the room, searching for an ally. But all she found were averted eyes and cold, hard facts. The HR rep stood up, gesturing toward the door. Gwen, please, we need to have a separate conversation. The walk of shame she took out of that room was the most satisfying thing I had ever witnessed in my career. The room remained silent for a long moment after the door clicked shut. Marisol looked at me, gave a singular, sharp nod of respect, and turned back to her files. Justice in the corporate world is a rare commodity, but today it was delivered with the cold, precise efficiency of a well-executed patch. The chaos she created had burned down the house, but as the smoke cleared, it was clear that she was the only one who wouldn't be returning to the office. I sat back in my chair,
Tailing a breath. I felt like I had been holding for years.
The system was finally, truly clean, The air in the boardroom was heavy, thick with the scent of stale coffee and the metallic tang of unspoken accusations.
Fact.
Gwen sat at the head of the table, her posture rigid, her face a mask of practiced indifference. She spoke in a tone that was meant to sound reasonable,
Thing.
claiming her decision was a classic judgment call driven by the frantic demands of a high-value client. Meridian Financial was breathing down our necks about latency issues, she said, waving a hand dismissively. Sometimes.
To choose between rigid bureaucracy and actual results.
Marisol, the lead auditor, leaned forward, her voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. What specific performance data are you referring to, Gwen?
Eek.
Gwen blinked, her confidence wavering for a fraction of a second. It was an informal conversation during the quarterly business review, she retorted. The client's CTO expressed concerns about query speeds.
Marisol didn't blink.
Did this CTO explicitly request that we bypass our staging validation protocols and push firmware updates to a live production database? Gwen's smile tightened,
Propped up.
her jaw clenching as she searched for an opening. I acted as a leader, she insisted. I had to prioritize the client's competitive responsiveness. I felt the pulse in my neck throb as I stood up to present my findings. Projected the email thread onto the screen, the blue light reflecting in the eyes of everyone in the room. Friday night, 9:15, I began, my voice steady. A junior engineer messaged Gwen. Per our call.
Want me to force the firmware update tonight and skip staging?
Confirming instructions. Gwen replied 3 minutes later. Correct. I need this resolved before Monday. Get it done. The room fell into a deathly,
suffocating silence.
Gwen stood her ground, her eyes flashing with a dangerous mix of defiance and desperation. I was merely communicating the pressure from the client, she spat.
Vision.
A competent engineer would have known better than to follow a verbal request that violated safety standards. He could have said no. Our CTO, a man who rarely raised his voice, leaned forward, his gaze locked onto Gwen.
Seems fairly explicit, Gwen. Is there an interpretation here that we're missing?
Gwen sighed, as if she were explaining a simple concept to a slow-witted child. Context matters, she said, looking around the room for an ally who didn't exist. I was conveying urgency, not overriding the change control board. Then Andre, the quietest member of the board, cleared his throat. I've reviewed the audit logs, he said, his voice flat and clinical. Gwen didn't just convey urgency. Her credentials were used to officially sign off on the bypass at 9:50 p.m. She didn't use the supervisor's login. She used her own VP override authority to bypass the mandatory security checks for financial transactions. The HR representative began scribbling furiously, her pen the only sound in the room. Gwen's face drained of color, her composure finally shattering like thin ice under a heavy boot. That authority exists for situations exactly like this, she shouted, her voice trembling. It's part of my role to make those calls. I stepped forward,
sliding a printed copy of the Corporate Compliance Manual across the table.
Section 4.2 of Policy Ops 147, I said, pointing to the highlighted text. VP override authority explicitly excludes critical data systems handling financial transactions. And here, on the bottom of page 12, is your electronic signature from last October. Gwen stared at the document as if it were a poisonous snake. Marisol spoke up again, her tone cold and final. Meridian Financial's contract mandates strict change control for all financial data. By bypassing these steps,
you haven't just ignored protocol.
Gwen, you have committed a material breach of contract. Their legal team is currently reviewing the implications. Gwen turned on me, her eyes burning with a desperate,
malicious light.
This is just you, isn't it? She hissed. You've been checked out for 2 weeks, refusing to help the junior team, and now you're orchestrating a prosecution to settle a grudge.
If you hadn't been so unsupportive, this never would have happened.
I met her gaze, unblinking, feeling nothing but a profound sense of clarity. I followed every documented transition procedure during my notice period.
Who replied?
This disaster happened because you chose to bypass the safety net and you did it without a single person's consultation or approval. Gwen stood up abruptly, her chair screeching against the floor.
To sit here and be attacked by a disgruntled employee who has already.
1 foot out the door. The CTO held up a hand, his face unreadable. That's enough, Gwen. We're taking a break. Gwen!
Please accompany the HR representative to my office.
As they walked out, Marisol caught my eye and gave a brief, singular nod. It wasn't a smile,
You.
but it was a recognition of confirmation that the truth had finally been placed on the record. The rest of the week was a surreal blur of quiet efficiency. Gwen was listed as working remotely on strategic initiatives, thin veil for the investigation that was currently stripping away her power. Her office remained empty, the lights permanently dark. On the 11th day of my notice, I was in the break room when the elevator chimed.
Please.
I looked up just in time to see Gwen walking toward the exit. She was carrying a standard issue cardboard box, the kind used for terminated employees. A security officer walked a few paces behind her,
Perfect.
his demeanor professional and entirely indifferent. Gwen's employee badge hung around her neck, but the way she carried herself told the story it was already dead weight. She didn't look at the desks.
Fangs it.
She didn't look at the colleagues she had bullied for years. She didn't even look at me. She just marched toward the glass lobby doors, a disgraced executive walking toward a future that no longer included this company.
You.
As the doors slid shut behind her, someone near the window let out a long, ragged breath and whispered, "Finally." I went back to my coffee, the heat of it grounding me. The next day, the CTO called me into his office one last time. He didn't need to say much. "Shez gone," he said simply, effective immediately. The weight that had sat on my chest for months finally lifted, leaving behind the quiet,
Steady hum of a workplace where rules actually mattered.
justice, it seemed, wasn't just a corporate policy, it was a reality. The office was unnervingly silent,
Fuseman.
the kind of quiet that feels like a held breath before a storm breaks. Stop! My CTO beckoned me into his office on my penultimate day, his expression a mixture of fatigue and grim realization. Stop! He didn't beat around the bush,
Affirming what the office whispers.
had been circulating for weeks. Gwen was finished. It was an immediate termination, wrapped in the sanitized, professional jargon of a mutual decision to pursue new paths.
The reality behind the curtain was far messier.
Legal had finally peeled back the layers of her email trails. HR had cataloged a mountain of policy breaches, and Meridianor, biggest client, had delivered an ultimatum.
Fused.
They had demanded a total overhaul of the operations leadership, making it clear that their continued partnership relied on structural integrity, not the toxic games Gwen played.
Fanged, he admitted.
They were acutely aware of how they'd mishandled my career, the stolen promotions, the way my visibility was buried, while she hoarded the praise, and the reckless way Shed dumped high-stakes risks onto my plate. He looked me in the eyes, offering the director role on the spot. He promised a complete shift in reporting lines, a salary that finally mirrored my actual contributions, and genuine, unchecked authority. He meant it.
Me too.
I could hear the desperate tremor in his voice, the sound of a man trying to plug a sinking ship with his bare hands. It was the very thing I had begged for 2 months ago. Yet as he spoke, felt like being offered a premium upgrade on a flight that had already disintegrated mid-air. I thanked him, truly, but I had already given my word to someone else. He nodded slowly,
Fingfind.
acknowledging that I had been right about every warning it ever sounded, and that he should have been awake enough to see the patterns earlier. Dot! I didn't spare him. I told him he had seen exactly what Gwen wanted him to see.
Because manipulation was her only true talent.
Dot. My final day was dedicated to a meticulous, hand-over-nearly 90 pages of exhaustive procedures, contact maps, and hard-won institutional knowledge.
Fusioned.
It was a roadmap that would take my successor months to master, assuming they possessed the humility to read it, instead of pinging me on LinkedIn for cheap shortcuts. I bundled the files and sent them to Andre with a single,
Finged.
stern reminder: don't let the corporate vultures pressure you into cutting corners, because those safety protocols were written in the blood of past mistakes. His reply hit my inbox within minutes,
Firming.
he was biding his time just long enough to secure his full pension before retreating to a fly fishing shop in Montana. He insisted. I visit and that I bring my kid along.
Fuse.
A rare moment of genuine warmth in a place that had become a freezer. On my way out, I stopped by the desk of the junior engineer. The kid Gwen had bullied into pushing that disastrous unauthorized firmware update.
Thing.
He looked shattered, haunted by a week of grueling depositions where he'd been forced to defend decisions he knew were wrong. He started to apologize, saying he should have fought her harder, but I cut him off.
Front.
I told him he was a junior staffer following the explicit written orders of his VP. He wasn't the villain here. I taught him the most important lesson of corporate life.
Beam.
Blame always travels upward to the person who holds the power, never downward, at least in any company worth its salt. I advised him that if someone in authority ever demands he skip a safety check again,
He must get it in writing.
and then think long and hard before hitting enter. His career would certainly outlast their temporary manufactured sense of urgency. I surrendered my badge, signed off on the equipment,
Thing.
acknowledged the end-day warning with a cold, robotic nod. The exit procedure was flawless, and just like that, I walked out of Sentinel Ridge on a sweltering Friday afternoon. There was no applause,
Thing.
no commemorative party, and no tearful goodbyes, just me, a cardboard box of personal belongings, and the smell of ozone from a brewing Charlotte rainstorm. When I walked through my front door, Jensen was sprawled on the couch, feed half distracted by basketball highlights on the television. He asked if it was truly the last day, and I told him it was. He asked how I felt, and I really sat with that question, thinking about the stolen years,
Vent.
the skipped dinners, and the endless panicked weekends spent cleaning up Gwen's messes. I thought about her cold, hollow smile and that callous remark about how my family only ate because of her permission. Pictured her walking out of the building with her own sad little box, and the answer hit me with absolute clarity. It felt good, actually. It felt incredible.
Fume.
I asked if we were still on for Chinese takeout and Terminator 2 on Sunday, and he grinned, saying he wouldn't miss it for the world. Monday morning, I walked into Redstone, armed with a fresh badge, a new laptop,
Feesum.
and a Slack workspace filled with people who actually looked me in the eye. My first briefing with the CTO focused entirely on incident response and team standards, and he laid it out clearly.
Everything had to be documented.
Everything had to be tested, and no one was ever allowed to leverage urgency as an excuse to bypass the right way of doing things. He emphasized that the right way was the only way,
Especially when it took longer.
I smiled, told him that was a language I spoke fluently, and settled in. My phone remained gloriously silent all morning. No emergency pages, no frantic texts,
No one.
begging me to save them from their own reckless choices. It was just the steady, healthy rhythm of a workplace that respected boundaries and understood that true system uptime wasn't about hiring a hero,
It was about building systems that functioned.
because the people behind them followed the process. Invested in stability and treated safety as a core feature rather than an inconvenience. 2 weeks later,
Thing.
Andre sent me a screenshot of a company-wide email detailing organizational shifts within operations. Gwen's name appeared exactly once, buried in the middle of the third paragraph.
Thank Gwen.
Holloway for her contributions and wish her well in future endeavors. The rest of the note was filled with dry, corporate fluff about operational excellence and leadership strengthening.
The kind of hollow script they used to hide the bodies.
Andra's commentary was brief 3 sentences to summarize her entire 4-year tenure. It was poetic, in a twisted, clinical way. I laughed, closed the notification,
Thinked.
and turned my focus back to a project that actually mattered. Some people never gain the wisdom to change, but that wasn't my burden to carry anymore. Guys, we are incredibly close to hitting that 100 Zen subscriber milestone on this channel. If you haven't joined our community yet, please hit that subscribe button, as it truly helps us grow and keep these stories coming.
Farsher.
Thank you for being part of this journey and making this goal a reality.